In the previous videos, we learned about basic QML objects and how we can interact with them. In this video, we will learn how to create our own custom components, as well as create custom properties, signals, and signal handlers. We will start with a new Qt quick application, which has a defined window and a column in its Main.qml file. To create a custom component, first we need to create a new QML file. Let's open the wizard to create new and select QML file. Then select Choose to Proceed. Now we need to name our QML file. Note that the name we set here will be our component's name. While naming, it is important to remember that the name must begin with uppercase letter and be comprised of alphanumeric characters or underscores. In this example, we will name our component My Component. Then click Continue. We will check the summary and click Done since we are satisfied with the default setting. After being created, the newly created QML file should appear in the project hierarchy. To make sure it has been added as a QML file inside the Qt add QML module function, let's open the cmakelists.txt file and check. Now, we are ready to define our custom component. We will start with a simple implementation. First, we define the custom component, which will be an image surrounded by a frame. Later, we will define custom signal and signal handlers to interact with it. Let's open the mycomponent.qml file. Since we use the Qt wizard to create the file, we can see that by default, the file has the Qt Quick module imported. We will be using the basic types that come with the Qt Quick module to define our custom component. We will start by defining an ID for the item type. Let's call it root. Since item is going to be our root level of object, we will initiate all the custom properties here. It will help us later to get and set the property values outside of the component. The first custom property we will initiate is a URL typed property named image URL. At the moment, let's leave it as an empty string and set the value later. It is also possible to define required properties. Required properties must be set when an instance of the object is created. Violation of this rule will result in QML applications failing to start if it can be detected statically. Here, we create a required property named frame color. Inside the item, let's define a rectangle type. This rectangle will contain our image and we'll set a frame around it. Let's bind its width and height to its parent's corresponding properties. Now we bind the rectangle's color property to its parent's custom property, frame color. Also, let's define a border around our rectangle. Now we define the image type inside the rectangle. We want the image to fill its parent with 30 pixel margins. We will also bind the source of the image to the root's custom property image URL. Now let's open the main.qml file and create an instance of our custom component inside the column. Here we will set values of all the undefined properties that we initiated in our custom component. After defining the width and height, let's set the image URL property and a color for the frame. For this example, we have already added an image as a resource file to this project. Let's enter that image's name to our image URL property. Now let's save and run the application. We can see that in the application window, there is a cat's picture with a light gray frame around it. Next, we want to implement some interactive functionality to our component. Let's close the window and jump back to the editor. To implement interactive methods, we will define custom signal and custom signal handlers. Let's open the mycomponent.qml file. Here, on the root level, we create a custom signal called cat-clicked. Now we need to execute an action to emit the signal. Let's scroll down to the image object. Here, on the image, we want to implement a mouse interaction to emit the signal. Therefore, let's define a mouse area. We bind the mouse area's anchor to its parent. Next, let's define the onClick signal handler and call the signal with an argument. When we click on the image, the custom signal should be emitted. Let's jump to the main.qml file and define a signal handler for the custom signal. Here, we want to print meow to our console every time the image is clicked. Let's save and run the application. To test the functionality, let's click the image a few times. Now let's check the console in our editor. Here we can see the message meow has been printed 4 times. Lastly, let's add another signal handler for our custom signal. This time we will implement it inside the custom component. It is good to note that this signal handler will exist for all the instances of the custom component. Here the goal is to show how many times the image is clicked on in the application window. We want this message to be printed on the image's frame. Therefore, first, let's define a text type inside the rectangle. Here we will also define a custom property called count to print the number of times the image is clicked. Let's place it in the center of its parent and set the value for our text. Now let's define a signal handler to execute the action. Let's scroll to the top, and below the custom signal, let's define a signal handler. Here the goal is to increment the count property's value every time the image is clicked. Now let's save and run the application. We can see in the window that there is some new text added on the top bar of the frame. To test the implementation, let's click on the image. We can see that the number of times we click on the image is shown on the frame. This concludes our video. Thank you for watching.